Greetings, folks. Stephen Gray here, in case you hadn't noticed from the logo behind me. Um, and you are either watching the Stephen Gray Vision YouTube channel or you are listening to this in audio on anchor.fm, which is spelled anchor.fm, and its connections to several other streaming services like, almost hate to mention it now, Spotify. It's developing a colored relationship or reputation at the moment. Anyway, enough about that silliness. More seriously, the purpose of these interviews, this channel altogether, is to share information and inspiration regarding consciousness transformation with a focus on the psychedelics in particular, but the overriding vision or purpose is this actual need for a great consciousness transformation process on this planet, as imagine most people like you who are watching this or listening to us this would agree. So having said that, I'm very happy to have with me Christopher Solomon today. He's going to be talking about a poorly understood plant, a misunderstood plant with that actually has great potential that most people do not know about. And I've listened to a couple of other things that Christopher has done, and in fact, he's spoken at our Spirit Plant Medicine conference several years ago, and he's an excellent communicator and educator on this. So I hope you will stay with us for the full hour because you're going to get an excellent bunch of information that's actually quite applicable. So Christopher is a somatic salvia guide. He's a teacher and the inventor of a pipe that aids in the mindful exploration of Salvia Divinorum. I'm going to ask him about that, a little bit about that pipe and how to use it later on. I think it's a very useful device. Incorporating lessons learned directly from Salvia and as a student of somatic psychotherapy, he's pioneering techniques to use Salvia as a therapeutic tool for guided self-healing, meditation, and introspection. Christopher lectures about the proper, intentional, and therapeutic use of salvia, offering a blend of scientific, esoteric, and therapeutic perspectives. He also cultivates a medicinal salvia garden for use in his practice with clients. So, welcome, Christopher.
Hello, thanks. Great to be here.
Yeah. Without further ado, as the old cliche goes, let's get right into it with the most basic question I can imagine asking you, which is I'm assuming that most people, probably the great majority of people who are going to watch this and or listen to it, are not familiar with the kinds of uses that you're talking about with salvia at all. They may have encountered some of these extracts in a shop, put it in a pipe
Mhm.
and had a strange experience, perhaps, but this is a whole other use of salvia from that, for the most part, from what I can gather from what you've been sharing. So give us the basics on
Mhm.
this plant, will you? It's a very unusual plant.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, like you said, most people have introductory experience with salvia where they got it from a smoke shop and they loaded it in a pipe and smoked it and had a bizarre experience, or sometimes it can be a scary experience if you take too much of a dose or too high of a dose of it. Um, but so Salvia divinorum is actually a part of the mint family. And there are many, many types of different salvias. There's over 500 different types of salvias. The regular sage that you buy from the grocery store to eat or make tea out of, that's a salvia. The white sage that one burns, that's a salvia. So for those of you who are watching visually and not listening, this is a baby salvia plant right here. So here she is right here. So you can see that it looks very much like, if you've seen coleus, it looks like coleus, or it looks like many other types of salvias. You can see there's the diametrically opposed leaves, looks very much like a mint leaf. The stem is square. And so, so Salvia divinorum, it's endemic to Oaxaca, to the mountain ranges outside of Oaxaca in Mexico. And it's been used there for quite some time specifically for healing physical ailments. And And the plant, which we can talk about in more detail, can be used in very many ways. Traditionally, it was used by chewing the leaves. Many people are introduced to salvia by smoking the salvia extract. So there's many different routes of administration, and how one ingests salvia can have a very different effect on our consciousness shifting experience of it. But at its most, basic level, Salvia divinorum is one of the many types of salvia, and this particular one has a component in it called Salvinorin A. And Salvinorin A is what gives the plant the psychoactive and consciousness shifting properties. And most people, when they do smoke salvia, they smoke too much. And so one of my main messages with salvia is that it can be used, instead of smoking one large bowl at a time, smoke very low doses over a course of time instead of packing it all up at front. And we can get into the more details about that as well, about the benefits of doing that and why that changes the experience so dramatically.
Yes, we should definitely get into that. Just before we move on, a little bit of, I think, interesting information, and please correct me if I didn't quite get this right. It was years ago when I came across it. If I'm not
Mm.
mistaken, the psychoactive, I don't even know if it's an alkaloid, whatever it is in the plant, the chemical in the plant,
Mhm.
perhaps Salvinorin A, there's no other plant has it. Isn't that correct? Is it not
That is,
unique
yeah.
to Salvia divinorum?
It's that is what they used to think, but they've
Ah,
recently found there are some other. There's another salvia, um, Salvia recognita, I think it is. I
hmm.
forget which salvia exactly it is that has small amounts of salvin RNA in it. Um, and then apparently coleus, which is kind of a common sort of salvia related plant as well. Coleus, they say, has salvinorin B in it. So there's salvinorin A, B, and I believe C. So when one
Hmm.
ingests salvinorin A, it's not an alkaloid.
Right.
Um, it affects the kappa opioid receptors in the brain. So it's a kappa opioid agonist. And so it's very, very unique in its chemical profile. It doesn't affect the serotonin receptors. It's not a 5-HT2A agonist. Um, but so Salvinorin A is the most concentrated in Salvia divinorum, but I think they're starting to find some other plants that have some Salvinorin A in it, albeit a whole lot less.
Mm. Well, it could just be a
Yeah,
quirky fascination on my part, but it's not in any kind of technical sense a psychedelic, and it is close
right.
to unique, as you say. It's very rare to find a plant with this in it, and as you say, this particular plant has way more of it than anything else, and yet. In some circumstances, although you've said that it's not necessarily visual per se, it
Mhm.
has the same potency and some of the same, in a general non-scientific sense, some of the same
Mhm.
effects that psychedelics do. Correct?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Definitely, yeah. It's the most potent naturally occurring hallucinogenic. I put that in quotes because, again, it's not typically hallucinogenic, but it's the most potent naturally occurring hallucinogenic substance that we know
that's right.
of. Yeah, yeah. Even, for a strong DMT experience, you might need, I think like a threshold DMT experience of NN-DMT, you'd need maybe, 5 milligrams to 10 milligrams would be like threshold. But with Salvinorin A, 1 milligram of it is a very intense experience. So it's and that is why dosing with salvia is such an important aspect because um, at a high dose. And, when you think of high dose, people think large numbers, but, we're just talking about like 1 milligram worth.
Before we get into
So,
that, because I do want you to go into
mm,
detail about that, please.
mm,
You haven't spoken, so I'm gathering that it's not very toxic either, right? Are you familiar with the term LD50?
yeah.
Yeah, so it's a dose of any particular medicine or substance. at which 50% of the people are going to die, right? And
Yeah. Right.
many pharmaceuticals have one. Nicotine, distinctly, alcohol, all those have an LD50. Is there a meaningful LD50 for salvia?
I don't know exactly what the LD50 is, but I do know that when I was a research participant in the study that Johns Hopkins did on Salvinorin A,
Mm-hmm.
this was back in 2018, I think it was. They gave me a high dose of pure vaporized Salvinorin A while I was in an fMRI machine. And so in order to do any sort of, and so what they were telling me is that in order to do, when I say they, I mean the researchers at Johns Hopkins, so Roland Griffiths, they were telling me that in order to do any human study, you have to prove to the FDA that this is a very safe substance to take. And so back in maybe the late 2000s, what they did is they did an initial study on Salvinorin A, and that initial study was just to prove the safety of it because they had to prove, hey, if we want to study the effects of this plant on people's brains, we have to first show to the FDA that it's safe. And so the way that they found the upper limit is they had the same participants come in, time and time again, and they just progressively gave them higher and higher doses of salvia. And it got to, and then took their vitals before and took their vitals after. And they got to the upper echelon when essentially everyone had a high enough dose to where they thought, you know what, like everyone tapped out of the study at that point. They were like, I don't want to go any further in the
I
study.
can imagine
Um,
with that plant. Yeah,
right, because
yeah,
they started to have scary experiences
yeah.
or very dissociative experiences where at a high dose of salvia, you can get taken outside of space and time and become, pure energy, which if that happens quickly can be jarring. But at the low doses, it's much more embodying.
Yeah.
So, um, mm, mm.
Sorry, that wasn't one of my gestures.
Oh no, that's fine. I thought you were going to say something.
No, no, no. But
Yeah.
I'd like to, yeah, I don't know what order to go through this all in, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about that issue because, as much better than I actually, but I know as well something about this. One of the reasons that salvia hasn't taken a wider, or a larger role, in the
Mm,
so-called psychedelic pantheon or cultural
mm,
use as a spiritual healing medicine is because most people haven't encountered it in these ways, and so they have these
right.
really weird experiences oftentimes, and weird like no other plant, right? I mean, I've heard
Mm.
people say, I've read up some of the testimonials on, is that still around, sagewisdom.org? Daniel, what's his
Yeah.
name?
And
Yeah.
Daniel Siebert's website.
What's his last name again?
Daniel Siebert. Daniel Siebert was actually the person who first isolated Salvinorin A and found out that it was Salvinorin A that had the psychoactive properties.
Mm. Yeah, so some of I think it was
Many.
there where I saw the testimonials where people were saying things like they turned into a chair or something like that, right? And Siebert himself, as he was as he was finding the dosage that was going to get him across the threshold at the beginning of that process that you just mentioned, I believe on the site there's this. It's been a long time since I read it, maybe 20 years, but my vague memory is that something like he said he was standing in uh, a room with his eyes
Mm,
open. And
mm,
after a while, he clued in that it wasn't his room. It was his, I think, grandmother's room or something, right? And this
mm,
was, I
mm,
believe, with his eyes open, right?
mm,
Um,
mm,
so, so not only, it seems like this plant not only can, take you beyond time and space, as it were, ego dissolving, etc., but it can put you into
mm.
some really strange places that don't seem to have anything to do with healing or spiritual work.
Right. Yeah. And that's why most people they have these bizarre experiences and they think that was intense, that was crazy, but at the end of the day, I think that's completely meaningless and there's no point to this. And and the thing is, there can be if you have a high dose of salvia, it can actually be physiologically uncomfortable.
Mm.
Um, you can, people talk about the feeling like their body is becoming unzipped, or people like getting torn into two different dimensions, or there's this very strong pushing and pulling feeling that can happen on the body. And so at these high doses, it's not just a radical change in one's visual perception per se. It's also a radical change in one's perception of what one thinks one's body is. And that's
Mm-hmm.
how one becomes inanimate objects and so on and so forth. Um, and then at the low doses, um, it's absolutely fantastic for meditation and finding a place of stillness and deep calm within, which so what makes Salvia interesting is that it's the same substance, but depending on the dose, it can might as well be a completely different substance. Um, if you smoke a big dose, you feel like you're getting pulled into another dimension. But if you smoke a small dose, you feel as if the mind, your chattering mind, begins to slow down, and you just feel as if being very still and very quiet is an extremely comfortable, therapeutic, healing experience. Um, and that's why it works so well actually as a somatic medicine. And that's why I incorporate somatic psychotherapy with Salvia when I work with my clients. So, I teach people about Salvia, but then I also guide them on Salvia journeys where, and since COVID started, I've actually moved my practice to doing all my sessions on Zoom. So I do Salvia sessions with people remotely via Zoom, which initially people when I used to see people in person before COVID happened, I had people emailing me all the time and being like, I'm in Australia or I'm in London or something like that, and I really want to have a Salvia session. Um, will you do it with me, remotely? And I thought, no, that doesn't seem like a very wise move to do, medicine work with people remotely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think COVID started, and there was this one person that he was very adamant about trying it. And he was like, I really want to try it remotely with you. And I did it with him remotely, and it ended up working out extremely well. And then I did it with another person on Zoom. And funnily enough, I've actually come to find that doing sessions with people via Zoom, Salvia sessions with people via Zoom, they're actually going deeper and having more benefits from the Salvia sessions than when I was doing it in person with them. And mhm,
Okay, so let me ask you more about that then. That's very, very interesting because the word
mm,
somatic, implies something to do with the body, right? So,
right.
I would have imagined you might have been doing body work or something like that. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what the mechanics of what you're doing when you're guiding people. How are you doing this? Actually, maybe we should
Mm,
step back a little bit more and just go through, you know, the whole way that you work, best practices. You've mentioned
mm,
dosage, but maybe this is also the time to talk about how you can control that, and this is where your pipe would come in, of course, right? So how
right.
the method of intake. We're talking smoking, but you want to control that dosage, and then set. We know basically you're there to heal or whatever, and the setting whatever. But then what do you do? How do you work with the person when you're on Zoom?
Yeah, yeah, all good questions. So the pipe, actually here's the pipe right here. So it is a 5 bowl water pipe. And so there's this little jar that you put a little bit of water in. There's a silicone downstem, and you pop that in here. And so the way I came up with the pipe actually was I was experimenting with very low doses of salvia myself, because I wanted to see what is the minimal amount of salvia that I need in order to experience anything at all. And so I started working with there's different strength salvia extracts, and so I started working with literally just one flake of salvia. And so I'd smoke that and say, okay, that's not enough to do anything. And then I'd try 2 flakes. And, I got to like the third flake and I'd realize, okay, I'm starting to feel something. And I'd noticed as I continued to work with these repeated small doses that the salvia experience started to open itself up to me in a very gentle, welcoming, soothing, supporting, nourishing way. But the problem I ran into is that as I was smoking these multiple bowls in a row, with a little bit of time between each one, what would happen was I'd be slightly in a cell altered space, and then I'd have to reload another bowl while I was in an altered space. And that's just not the best thing for harm reduction. And also, I'd have to break my concentration, break my mindfulness, break focusing my breath and my body. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if there was a pipe with multiple bowls on the pipe that I could just preload with the doses that I know I'm going to use? And then I don't have to reload the bowl mid journey. And so I was looking around for it and it didn't exist. And so figured I might as well make it. And so it's creatively titled the Salvia pipe. You can get it on salviapipe.com.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so you can see that these five bowls, and what you do is you would just put a tiny amount of salvia in each one. And then it's a water pipe. So you smoke that bowl. And then when you're
Mm-hmm.
ready to move on to the next one, what you do is you just pick it up and rotate the bowl like that.
Ooh,
And then you
nice.
move it like that.
Yeah, nice,
And then you can
nice.
smoke,
Right.
yeah, smoke
So,
that one.
so this,
And then,
oh yeah, pardon me, didn't mean to interrupt there. This, this is a really useful device, and I have a couple of questions about it. First of all, I want to say to our audience, this is not a promotional video. This is an educational interview. But
right.
this seems to be, in my mind, and don't worry, I don't get any commission from this, but a very useful device. So on that note, let me ask you, can you ship over borders?
Yes.
Yes. And how much do you charge for this device?
The pipe is $60, 60
Not,
US dollars.
not bad. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. I
So
make everyone myself by hand as well. And so it's all custom done and made right here at home.
excellent. Yeah. No middleman, as it were.
Right.
So now this dosage issue, though, strikes me as very important. I have a couple of questions about that. One is, for the people that might be watching this, and I'm even thinking of myself, like maybe someday I'll order one of these pipes, and then, um, I don't know what, I'm in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I don't know. I haven't checked in years if people have these still in stores, but
Mhm.
what should I be looking for? How do I control the dosage? How do I titrate properly? You said a little bit, but would you not want to be
Right.
pretty specific about that? Like, for example, if I, are they still doing these 5 times, 10 times, 20 times extract
Mhm.
things? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
how
they are.
make it detailed for us, please.
Yeah, great. So when I work with clients, I use 5x extract. And so for those of you who don't know what that actually means, so plain salvia leaf. So what you could do, like with this salvia plant right here, and again, this is just a baby, so she's going to get a whole lot bigger. It can get to about 10 feet tall, and they can really become extremely large plants. And so just plain leaf like this, picked and dried, you can smoke the plain leaf. I guess that would be considered 1x.
Mm.
Um, and then 5x would mean you take 5 grams worth of salvia and you extract the Salvinorin A out of that. And then you re-infuse the Salvinorin A back on 1 gram of leaf. So you're essentially taking 5 grams worth of leaf and um, infusing it onto 1 gram's worth of leaf. 10x is you take 10 grams of plain leaf, get the Salvinorin A out of it, put it back in 1 gram of leaf. And it goes all the way up to like 400x. I think 400x is pure crystal Salvinorin A. I don't really go much higher than 5x ever because it's not necessary. I really think places who are selling like 60x and 100x, um, they're just marking up the price a whole lot higher, and it's really not necessary because you can have a strong experience using plain leaf.
Hmm.
Now, the one thing that's tricky is dosing with plain leaf. So I prefer using standardized extract because I know how much each dose takes. So the thing with salvia leaves are each salvia leaf has the same amount of Salvinorin A on it after it's a certain size. So you can have a salvia leaf that's this big, like let's say for those who are listening, you can have a salvia leaf that's 2 inches big, or you can have a salvia leaf that's 4 inches big. And each one is going to have the same amount of Salvinorin A on it. So if you're smoking plain leaf and you smoking crushed plain leaf, you don't really know if you're smoking the plain leaf that came from a small leaf or a big leaf. And so it makes the consistency a little bit tricky to kind of figure out. And when you don't know what you're getting, especially with entheogenic substances, it can add a sense of discomfort, like a little bit of trepidation. And, before one goes onto any sort of like entheogenic journey, there's always a little bit of trepidation, or generally there should be, unless you're just, and if there's not, then soon you're going to find out that you can get your ass handed to you. So approaching these things in a humble manner is very important. Um, but so the reason why I like to use standardized extract is because it's like the same across the board every time. And so I like to use 5x with my clients. And then usually if one really wants a number, like if you want like a volume to go by, um, I would say 1/64th of a teaspoon
Whoa.
of 5x. Yeah,
That's a refined measurement, yeah. So in that
yeah.
bowl there, if you were putting some into that bowl, I mean, just as a rough thing for, somebody, it's like it's just a very small amount in the bottom of one of those bowls to start with.
Yeah, like salvia extract, they come in like little individual flakes. It looks like they're
Hmm.
flakes.
Yeah.
So what I recommend people do is, they start with just 3 flakes and put 3 flakes in a bowl, or maybe as many flakes that would take up the area of, say, the head of a match.
Hmm.
Um, and there's this big one of the many misconceptions online is people say online, like, you have to smoke your salvia with a torch lighter, which is not true. You can use a regular bic lighter and that's fine. um, and they say you have to smoke it all in one go, and there's so like the information out there is really done a disservice to people, because it's told people you got to rush, you got to hit it really big, and then otherwise you'll miss your window. And that's actually not the case at all. So what you can do is you can smoke enough to actually not feel anything. And so when I work with clients, each bowl in and of itself is enough to maybe feel a little bit of something.
Hmm.
And so we'll they'll smoke the first bowl, and we'll talk about the intentions beforehand and what they want to get out of it and how to engage with the plant. And as one continues to grow and develop a relationship with salvia, one can take more of an active approach, and one can take more of an engaged approach to the plant. Um, by that, I mean you can come to it with specific questions. You can send the energy that arises in your body during a salvia experience, you can send that energy to different parts in your body if they need healing, um, or if you have migraine, or it's very, very good for indigestion, stomach cramps, menstrual cramps as well. So you can send the energy to various parts in your body if you need to um, engage with your body on the front of healing on a physiological level. But initially, I recommend to people to just take a passive approach. So active approach is you're engaging with the plant, you're making requests of it, and you're working with it in real time. The passive approach would be you smoke a little bit of salvia, and then you sit there with a sense of open-ended, dynamic, just tracking and awareness, and seeing what's arising as it's arising. Because, you know, initially you're getting to know salvia, and salvia is also getting to know you. Salvia is definitely one of those plants where it works best if you use it as a practice over time instead of going to it for like one healing thing. You can say, oh, well, with ayahuasca, people go, they have this one ayahuasca experience and boom, that just everything falls into place after that. And sometimes that's all they need. That can be the case with salvia, but with salvia, it's going slow over time, and sort of as you get to learn the plant and the various ways that it can show up in you, salvia sort of gets to know you and all the various ways that you can show up for it. Even within a session, someone can have, so we smoke 5 bowls over the course of a session. Even each bowl in and of itself can be a little bit different between the two. So the first bowl, they might experience a sense of calmness and a sense of comfortable heaviness coming over their body. But then the second bowl, they might experience random memories and thoughts coming up. Then the third bowl, they might experience one part of their body becoming very activated, but not in an agitated way, usually in a way where one can feel that there's a specific sort of energy congregating in different parts of one's body. And this is where the somatic work comes into play, where you can actually have a dialogue with different parts of your body. So it's not somatic work where I'm the practitioner doing hands-on or making your body do any movements or anything like that. The somatic part comes into play because at a low dose with salvia, one can achieve such a place of stillness and quietness within, and the language centers of one's brain begin to kind of shut down in a way. So one actually starts to think archetypally and symbolically, and one starts to be able to communicate through one's body in a felt sense, almost like telepathically communicating with different parts of your body. And it's when you're in that stage that one can bring in, internal parts work. Very often people can have regression to childhood memories, or a very young part of themselves shows up. And then they can have a dialogue with that young part of themselves. Um, I mean, there's so many ways that salvia shows up differently within different people. And, but I'd say if I were to make like an overarching generalized statement about some benefits that people get from low doses of salvia, it's very good for people if they have levels of high anxiety, if they are feeling depressed, and if they're feeling as if things in their life feel kind of scattered. Salvia does a really, really excellent job of one can actually feel salvia taking the disparate, disconnected parts of one's life and bringing it all back together and bringing it into a central focus point within one's body. So that's what I mean when I say it's embodying. You can actually physically feel a sense of coming home to a safe, comfortable, warm, soothing place that lives within one's own body.
So I've kind of fallen behind on the number of questions that have come to mind while you were saying that. Very interesting. Thank you. Let's see if we can plow through a couple more here. One of them is just a very specific logistical question about the use of the 5 bowl pipe. Uh,
Mm.
the when you smoke it, the experience is very brief, right? So what's the actual timeline? If I have the 1 bowl, and then I'm going to smoke a
Mm.
second bowl, are we talking like 2 minutes apart, or what's the deal
I
with
like
that?
to wait. Yeah, good question. I like to wait at least 5 minutes,
Hmm.
um, because, and this is where the guidance in doing a session with me can be helpful, or with, um, because managing expectations is quite interesting, because people who have had experiences with MDMA or DMT or mushrooms or LSD, they they go into the salvia experience looking for a DMT-like experience. They're looking for colors. They're looking for extreme insight and aha moments. Um, and so they're so busy looking for that they're actually missing out what's happening. And generally what happens at these light doses is you're no longer stressed. Your mind isn't chattering at 100 miles an hour. Your breathing becomes effortless. You feel comfortable and safe and warm. But that's not fancy colors and light and fireworks and stuff like that. And so people can overlook what's actually happening while it's happening. So many people, they'll be, 2 minutes into the experience and they'll say, "Oh, I don't really think that anything's happening." And so then, they smoke more, and then, oops, I've smoked a little bit too much. So the big thing is going at your own pace and actually going slower than you think you need to go. So between the first 2 bowls, I always wait at least 5 minutes.
Good one.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
another kind of logistical or applicable question, and that's kind of my focus a lot with these interviews anyway, is like, what can people take away from this and apply in their own lives? So, here I
Right.
am in Vancouver, British Columbia. Maybe I get my hands on your Salvia pipe.
Mm,
How reliable, maybe this is the question I would ask, like if I can find some in a store, this is not really a
mm,
regulated market, right? How do I know that
mm.
if it says 5 times, it's 5 times, or that they haven't adulterated it, or is there any kind of reliability about getting one's hands on the product, the plant?
Well, I mean, I grow and make all my own salvia extract. And so I like using my own medicine that I make. Um, it's, I can't really speak to other vendors and reliability. I've never bought something that wasn't salvia that was sold as salvia.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, when one buys salvia, one's as I mean, in my personal experience, one's probably pretty much going to get salvia.
Hmm.
Um,
Good.
I've noticed that the condition that the plant is grown in can sometimes come through in the felt experience of the plant. There was this one particular salvia this brand of salvia, and I don't remember what it was now because it was quite a few years ago, but I smoked it. And as soon as I smoked it, I just felt like this sadness coming into my body.
Hmm.
And I was just like, wow, I could just tell that the salvia wasn't grown in a good environment. It might have been grown purely for the sake of just, growing a lot of it in an industrial manner and maybe with artificial lights and pesticides and who knows what else. Um, so,
We know that about
there's,
cannabis as well. This is a
mhm,
commonly held view with cannabis as well, that
mm,
the grower's attitude of devotion, love, treating it as a sacred plant. Some growers say
mm,
that the feedback they get is very much that, like that, that it makes a huge difference.
mm,
People will say to them, wow, this is really different from the stuff that I usually get on the
yeah,
street or whatever. Yeah, yeah. So
right,
I'm really
yeah.
glad you shared that. Yeah. Now that I've interrupted you anyway, still we're talking about how to work with this plant, best practices, and so on.
Mm.
Uh, with these more gentle, low dose approaches, I gather that you think people could do this by themselves, but you wouldn't recommend it without at least a sitter. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. Why?
And the reason why is because if one does have a little bit too high of a dose, which again can be easy to do, um, people can get up and start walking around without really realizing that they're walking around. Salvia is
Mm-hmm.
such at a higher dose has such a there is such an objective nature to the shift in one's consciousness that one can sometimes actually think that, well, my consciousness has just changed so much, and it's just because that's what's happened. It's not because I've smoked salvia.
Hmm.
I've never had an LSD experience and thought that the visions I was seeing was from anything other than the LSD. Um, so, but with salvia, it's such a visceral change in one's consciousness that sometimes people think, oh, if I just get up and leave this room, then the experience will end.
Hmm.
There can be you can think, okay, well, the universe or the world has changed in this room right now, but I'm sure in the next room it's back to normal. There's this interesting locality thing that comes up, and you think, okay, well, if I can just get up and walk there. But the problem is, at a higher dose, one's motor coordination is compromised. One's speech is compromised. So you can get up and you can like trip and hit your head on the side of a table. Um, so it's just best to have someone there and until you learn what your own proper dosage is as well. That's another thing when I do a session with people is part of the first session that we have together is just helping you figure out what the right dosage is for you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some people are more sensitive, other people are hard heads. If someone doesn't want to smoke 5 bowls, they don't have to smoke 5 bowls. I'm really not dogmatic about the way I work.
Mm-hmm.
If someone gets 3 bowls in and they say, you know what, I think that's good for now. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, great. this is your experience. This is your journey. You're the one that knows yourself more than anything else. You're the one that knows what you're experiencing more than I do. So I'm not going to be like a pushy jerk and say, no, you have to finish 5 bowls or else. Um, it's very much about helping you discover salvia itself so that in the long run you can have a long-term relationship with salvia. Many people find salvia very useful for insomnia, for example,
Hmm.
and they can't have a session with me randomly at 3 a.m. if they can't sleep. And so what I like to do is teach a man to fish type thing, just teach you how to engage with salvia and how to use it for one's benefit, and what sort of things to come to salvia for as well.
Mm. So you
So
can use
there's
it quite frequently with no downside. There's no addictive aspect of it. Or what about tolerance? I mean, can people use it? Like you said for insomnia, could you actually use it every night for insomnia?
with tolerance, salvia is interesting actually because there's reverse tolerance with salvia, so you need
Wow.
less of it over time.
Mm.
So and there's a few reasons for this. One is it creates neurogenesis of our kappa opioid receptors in our brain, and so there's actually more receptors available in order to take up the Salvinorin A once you smoke it. But then also there's a felt somatic sense of learning that happens. And when on a cellular level, there's cellular learning that happens. And one learns what the salvia state feels like, and one can become very sensitized to it. So, you know, I'll have a tiny amount of salvia and I'll feel that more than someone who's never had salvia before.
Very interesting.
Um,
I've heard that about
and
ayahuasca as well. With the ayahuasqueros are doing it like 10 times a month. They hardly need any to get there. And now that I've
right.
interrupted you again, another question kind of related to that is that you've spoken about this plant working in a very different way than well, in some regards, a different way than say other psychedelics. Oh, yes. So I want to
Mm,
ask you a question, but I also want to share something with people, with you too, that I think you'll relate to, which is
mm,
just recently did an interview with Jeremy Narby, and what you said a little while ago was something I really liked about how people are kind of looking for the bright lights and the bells and the whistles and all that stuff, and missing what's
mm,
really going on. Well, Jeremy talks
mm,
about that. I mean, Jeremy has spent 35 years working with people like the Ashaninka in Peru or whatever that were somewhere in South America, and being
mm,
around the people all the time. In fact, his most recent book, Plant Teachers, is more or less co-written with an ayahuasca shaman from down there. And basically, what they're saying is that these bright lights and stuff is a distraction, and that
mm,
in fact the vine itself, don't want to just go too far away here, of course, but the vine itself, even without a DMT containing plant, is referred to as a plant teacher, as a healer, as a guide. But it's
mm,
not. It's slower. There's not as nearly as much visual stuff. So I'm really glad that you're bringing that out about salvia, that it's coming in this gentle way. And so the question that I want to ask you about that is if you could elaborate a little bit more on how, well, you actually personified her or it a little while ago, saying that she or it is getting to know you. So you've actually encountered uh, like something that you might call the spirit of salvia, correct? And so how is salvia actually working with people, I guess is the question I want to ask
mm, mm.
in
Yeah.
in a spiritual
So
healing, kind of way, mental way, whatever.
yeah, right, right. So one thing that many people experience at these low doses with salvia is like I was saying, they'll initially feel this sense of like calm coming over them. They'll feel, someone said it felt like a weighted blanket was on him. Um, but so yes, there's the physiological, comfortable feelings of being, feeling like you're in a warm, safe space. But one aspect of as well is there's the sense of a very profound felt sense of salvia witnessing one, salvia observing one. And with that, there's a very strong sense of that feels like it comes from this other entity, the sense of empathetic understanding. Um, I was working with someone recently, and he had a lot of sadness come up, and he felt the sadness in his heart, and it was very palpable. And what he felt at the same time, though, was Salvia was witnessing that sadness with him. And Salvia just said to him, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And it was, and he was just so moved. And he was just like, this is the first time I've actually ever had the felt experience of something understanding the hurt that's in my heart. And there was just this beautiful, caring witnessing that he experienced. Um, and then with that, so, after Salvia witnessed the hurt in his heart, then he just physically felt her wrapping around it, keeping him safe. Um, because there was also, and this is where the parts work came into play as well, because there were various, there was a sense of various other parts of his historical self inhabiting other parts of his body. So there was the side to himself that thought he had to really push himself hard all the time. Because it's just, because if you, as soon as you stop going and as soon as you stop achieving, then everything's going to fall apart. So there was this extremely vigilant part of himself, um, and then there was the sad part in his heart, and then there was another part of himself that just kind of wanted to like let go and have fun. And so all of these parts were there together, and he could tell how they were energetically residing in different parts in his body. um, but before he could actually have an open dialogue and communication with them, for him, he first needed the sadness in his heart to be witnessed. And then he needed, after it was witnessed, for it to be made safe and protected. So it's almost like Salvia was like weaving this. He said it felt like a mix of like a net or magnetic lines going around his heart, keeping it safe and keeping the inner child that was within his heart safe. And then once that protection was there, and once he felt as if he had Salvia there with him by his side, then he could have a dialogue with the part of himself that was hypervigilant. And then he could have a dialogue with a part of himself that was, just wanting to like kick back and relax and have fun and not think about tomorrow. And so, and because really at the end of the day, all of this work, a lot of this medicine work is just you getting information about yourself, and it's information gathering, it's learning. That that's where the wisdom comes from, and the insights are essentially you learning information about yourself. And with Salvia, this information can come from not your thinking mind, because again with Salvia that part shuts down. It comes from your body, and it comes from this deeper place that has a lot of inherent wisdom in it.
God, I got so many
um,
questions for you. Don't want to get distracted too much, but when you say the thinking part, without going into it particularly, are you aware? Would you call that the default mode network that they talk about with, say, psilocybin? That certain part of your brain that's like that, that's sort of the thinking language part, quiets down and allows for connections in other parts of the brain. And so, is that what you're talking about? And also, has anyone, I kind of doubt it, but it'd be interesting to know from you, has anyone done that kind of MRI, imaging, the way they have? Have you seen those, you know, drawings or whatever with the brain with
mm,
psilocybin and how it lit up all these connections in different parts of the brain? Has anyone done anything like
yeah.
that with salvia?
Johns Hopkins has, they did, and that was again the part of the study that I was involved in. They took, I think it was 12 participants, and they gave us all fMRIs, and those results were just released some months ago. And I tried to read the results, but it was quite technical. And so they did mention the default mode network, and they did mention that it has a similar effect on the default mode network as, say, psilocybin would. Um, but they also spoke about these three other types of brain connections that happen and how it alters each one. Um, So, you know, I read their results, and even after reading their results, I was like, this still doesn't quite yet explain exactly what's going
Mm,
on. Um,
yeah.
so, you know, with the default mode network, it's more like this, you know, automatic thing that's this well-worn rut that's just going over and over again. Um, but so that part of the brain shuts down, but also the part of the brain that shuts down is the ability to actually even verbalize and speak. Just physically speaking becomes difficult.
Mm.
Um,
What
so
about remembering afterward, like the insights that you've received or whatever?
yeah, that's a good point. At higher doses, salvia is definitely can be quite a profound amnesiac. You can forget things pretty quickly. Like it can fade a lot like a dream.
Mm.
And but this is actually something that's quite important as well, in that if if we are only going to rely on our ability to remember what happened to be the source of our healing, then as soon as we forget something, you know, you might have a profound experience, but then when you forget it, you know, kind of like goes into the ether, and you're like, well, did it really happen then, you know? But with salvia, I like to actually say to people, don't try to remember what happened. I mean, you can if you want, but don't put your energy there. Just put your energy on focusing what's happening while it's happening. Because
Mm-hmm.
again, the healing is not coming from your brain's ability to remember something. The healing is coming on a deep somatic cellular level.
Mm.
So when you're having these healing experiences or these meditative sessions on salvia, you know, people think, well, oh, should I be doing something? Should I be doing something more? Um, and it's just like, no, just focus on what's happening. Of Focus on the feeling of lightlessness. When last did you feel like you were floating weightless in space with not a care in the world and feeling warm and safe? It's in those experiences right there that's where the healing resides. Um,
That's very
I think it's
interesting.
similar to how same way that people want these big, you know, colorful experiences on ayahuasca or things like that, people also really want a cool story to tell. They're like, oh, I wanted to like, you know, then like the jaguar came to me, and then the fox spoke to me, and
Yeah,
then
I
all
know.
these things
Yeah.
happen. And they
Yeah.
want to come back with this great epic tale,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And salvia is just like, that's not important, really. Like, what's important is being with the healing presence while you're there and
Beautiful.
getting the healing in real time. And that's what's going to stick. And then you don't have to rely on your memory, or you don't have to rely on your storytelling abilities. And as well, when you're trying to like remember everything to like tell a good story about something, you're kind of you're not focusing on the healing that's happening.
You're
It's a
freezing it
distraction.
too. You're freezing it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
um, now you spoke a while ago about how the learning works in symbolic ways oftentimes, but you've also said elsewhere, not in this interview yet, that she can be very direct. Or actually, you did mention it once or twice, but she can actually. Or I don't know if you call her she, shall call it she or not, but I'll say she. I kind of like the sounds of that. She can be quite direct too, right? And she has been that way with you personally, correct?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I've met various genders, you know, he's, hims, hers, you know, little children, old men,
Them.
you know, Salvia shown up to me, them exactly is it's shown up in multiple different ways. Um, but Salvia definitely doesn't mince around, you know, there's a very pragmatic approach to Salvia. Um, just straight to the point, cuts through all the bullshit. Um, and you know, one thing that happens as well with salvia is it can actually it takes away our ability to feel specific emotions as well. There
Mm.
can be an emotional muting effect, which makes it really good for trauma work as well. So, you know, if I'm working with someone and they want to revisit a painful memory, salvia can kind of, when you're on the effects of salvia, you don't feel so intrinsically tied to your emotions anymore.
Mm.
Um, and so you can remember a painful memory, and actually what it does is it gives you the opportunity to sever the connection. Let's say there's someone that you just really can't stand, for example. Let's say someone who is like you know, an asshole to you in your life, and every time you think about them, you get furious and you get angry. And so, and that becomes your default mode network. You know, you think about someone, your heart rate increases and you get angry. And then before you know it, you're having this long made up conversation with them and it's taking you out of the present moment. But with Salvia, what you can do is you can bring these same memories to mind, you can recall them, and there can be the severing of the connection. So, um, you know, I was working someone with someone actually just a few weeks ago, and had a lot of anxiety in his chest. And so when there's anxiety in his chest, there's the physiological feeling of tightness in the chest. And so every time he would become aware of the tightness in his chest, he would then, you know, get into a cold sweat and his panic responses would get even more, you know, because he's like, oh crap, here's this feeling in my chest. And I know what that means. But then on Salvia, he still felt the tightness in his chest,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't cascade off into all the other effects.
Mm.
And so, you know, and Salvia said to him, you can feel tightness in your chest, but it doesn't mean that you have to have the rest of these other reactions.
Very interesting.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, there can be a decoupling that happens.
Well, thanks for sharing that. That is really interesting to me. You know, it reminds me a little bit, in a different way, of course, to the way that people talk about how MDMA works with PTSD, where although
Mm,
perhaps the biggest difference is that it doesn't just shut down the fear factor. In that case, it's specific. It tends to shut down the fear associated with bringing those, past traumatic memories up into consciousness. But it also adds in compassion. And
right.
I don't know if you've experienced MDMA, but I've found that too. So that's
Mm,
an interesting one. But yes, being able to take a clear look at it, that's great. And if you don't mind, I'd like to make a comment too about something you said a little while ago, which I think is actually really important going forward. I've talked to
mm,
Bruce Damer about this one, and you use this word parts, and Bruce has used the word parts. And
mm,
the way Bruce talks about it is he says this is actually kind of a revolutionary thing, in our species, that we're actually coming to recognize that the trauma that we have, that gets in the way and screws things
mm,
up, for ourselves and the people around us, is these
mm,
parts, and you mentioned that they're related to the past, they're both mental and held in the physical body. So I just want to say that I
mm,
think that's really wonderful that you're addressing this and showing how salvia can show you that kind of thing.
mm, mm.
There's
Yeah,
no question
definitely.
there, but say what you want.
Well, as well as being able to, you know, discern these, you know, individuated parts within us, one thing that Salvia is very useful for as well is, and very, very early on, sometimes even just on the second bowl, so only like 10 minutes into a session, making us feel much bigger.
Hmm.
And so what happens is our energetic, you know, the boundaries of our physical body kind of cease to be there in a way. And if one feels like there's a big emotion, like let's say there's anger, which is like a big emotion, it can feel like it takes up a lot of space in one's body. With salvia, what happens though is one can feel much, much bigger. And if you really sit there on a low dose of salvia, meditating with your eyes closed in stillness and in silence, one can feel comfortably infinitely large. One just feels extremely big.
Hmm.
So that can be very empowering for some people, especially if they have felt sort of contracted and small their
Hmm.
entire life, to feel this bigness. But what's nice about it is it's not bigness where it's a sense of like cockiness and pride bigness. It's it's such a tangible physical feeling of bigness that any other emotions that we're feeling, such as fear or anxiety or anything like that, by comparison, feel a lot smaller. And so it's not so much about taking one's trauma and making it smaller. It's by recognizing the largeness of our own beings and seeing how, in relation to the largeness of our psyche, whatever trauma we have doesn't actually take up as much room as we think it might.
Very
So,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, it gives us a sense of perspective.
Excellent. Yeah. So I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about, and this has been, I think, fascinating. And as I think I've said earlier in this conversation or this interview, uh, uh, I want these interviews to be useful for people. And my sense is that I agree with you. from the way you're advocating for and educating about this plant is that this plant needs to be, it can be and could be of great benefit to take a much larger role in society. And I'm sure you would
Mhm.
more than agree with that. And but maybe you could just sum up with, how you see salvia's development in the culture.
Right, right. Yeah, this is a very good question because it's because of the importance of proper dosing and because of the fact that it's not necessarily recreational. Um, it can, even after I've had a very pleasant salvia experience, there's nothing that makes you want to go back to it, which is
Mm.
interesting. Which ties into the earlier question you said about like addiction. There's no one gets addicted to salvia because even if one has I can be sitting there meditating, I can have a wonderful salvia meditation session, and then after it fades away, there's no hankering to come back and do it again. And that's why more than the other plants or more than the other medicines, I feel it is a practice. You kind of have to make yourself do it. um, and so, for this reason, people aren't flocking to salvia. And, it's because the salvia experience itself, when you meditate with it and do it at these low doses, is such a personal, private, internal experience. Um, I don't see like huge salvia centers opening up and stuff like that, or large salvia group retreats, because people really just want to go within and they want to be still and they want to be quiet. So there's no pomp and circumstance. There's no singing and dancing. There's no Icaros. Um, Traditionally, in the Mazateks, they do sing and pray with it. Um, but generally speaking, I've found for most people it lends itself much well to using it as a meditative plant.
Mhm.
Um, but because there's this learning curve, once one knows how to use salvia, then one's golden, then one's good, you know. But it's tricky to just say, all right, everyone smoke salvia. You can't just make like a blanket recommendation like that. So, I definitely do think it would be very helpful if a lot of people could get a salvia practice going in their life. Um, but one just needs that initial teaching, that initial help, that initial guidance, and then after that one can be on one's way. And some people, they use, I use salvia as needed. But because people say like, well, how often should I smoke salvia, like, or do you smoke salvia every day? So I find myself using it when I'm feeling like I'm getting sick. It boosts one's immune system incredibly well, better than anything I found. I actually haven't used an antibiotic in about 10 years because I just, every time I feel like I'm getting sick, I'll smoke some salvia and it just boosts one's immune system. And that's because the kappa opioid receptor system is intrinsically tied to our immune system. And with from has food poisoning as well, it's very, very good at just getting rid of the stomach issues from food poisoning. So if I'm getting sick, I'll use salvia. Um, I call salvia the great neutralizer because if you're feeling like kind of agitated and high and manic and a little bit anxious, salvia will kind of like bring you down to a nice stable baseline. But if you're feeling very low down and lethargic and depressed, salvia will bring you up. So if you're up, it'll bring you down. If you're down, it'll bring you up. And it's and this is where the intuitive learning comes into play as well. People, after they learn how to work with salvia, intuitively know, okay, this is something I can go to salvia for. And one kind of gets in one's own rhythm, one gets in one's own groove. And again, that's why I say it's a very relational aspect of the plant, where it becomes just a personal journey that you're on with for
Yeah,
years over time.
wonderful. Okay, well, Christopher, I feel like you've made an excellent case for this plant, and I really hope that enough people are influenced by your work and your education to see this plant it be a helper. It's a helper. It's a healer, right? And it
Right.
and it has
Mhm.
these unique ways that are, I think, actually quite amenable to being used by a lot of people. Safe, gentle in the ways that you've promoted it, radically different from the sort of horror stories that you hear. And so I'll
Mhm.
just say, oh, I was going to just say thank you, but before I do that, could you tell my audience, our audience, what you would like them to check, anything you'd like them to check out, actually?
Sure, yeah. You can check out my website, which is salviahealings.com. You can send me an email at christopher@salviahealings.com. And there's an article I wrote on my website about the benefits of low dose salvia. I also wrote another article about my experience in the Johns Hopkins study. There's a few other podcasts that I've done. Um, but really, I really do enjoy working with people and educating people. So for anyone listening or watching, really feel free to reach out to me at my email address, christopher@salviahealings.com. We can have a call over Zoom. I can answer any questions you may have, because many people have specific questions. And so I do, like, 20-minute free consultation where we can just chat over Zoom and talk about things. And so, yeah, don't hesitate to reach out. And I'm here for you if you need it.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, thanks again. Nicely advocated for.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.